here. You guys haven't signed up for an interesting, or signed up for an interesting case. Everyone watching, and of course to Alex, who's just an excellent partner all weekend. So I'm going to just start off by addressing this one problem that we have. When you impose sanctions on a country, which is what the case is talking about, it's not, the resolution that we were given is whether or not the United States should impose severe sanctions on countries that do not privatize their oil industries. So the problem is that all the arguments that they've given are only about whether or not privatization is better than government control of oil. They have given no arguments whatsoever whether or not sanctions is something that's actually going to make sure that any sort of change takes place, even if they are correct that privatized oil is a better way of going. And they need to be able to give arguments to do that to show whether or not this is a plan that actually should be adopted by the United States. So I think there's several reasons why the United States should adopt this plan. And the first is that when you impose sanctions on a country, sanctions are something that are universally looked upon as an act saying that you did something wrong in this country, that the people of this country are responsible for doing something wrong, and so that's why we're imposing this sanction. But they've never explained what it is that that country did that was wrong, that deserves something such as a sanction. Sanctions go towards the people, so it's hurting the people of the country. It's basically a severe sanction isn't just like closing down an embassy that they talk about. A severe sanction is making sure that you don't trade with those countries, and imposing any sort of measure that you do so that people don't get money in the country, so that people don't have the ability to eat. So what happens is that the people on the bottom are punished for the actions of the government, but they've never explained why it's a punishable offense and why imposing these sanctions is actually going to cause any change whatsoever. So they've never actually addressed the point of the case at all. The only thing that they've talked about in this round at all is whether or not it's better to have privatized industries, and I don't even think they've proven that. So Alex talks about how imposing this unilaterally is also a bad idea, why this shouldn't be the United States who's doing it by itself. We get no response to this idea at all. They simply say, well, the United States should do it because they're the world's single greatest economy and they're really great and they should do all these things. This is the same sort of rhetoric that leads to things like the Iraq War, that leads to other countries disliking us. It's not just hippies in the street saying, I don't like that the U.S. government is doing this. It's other world governments that refuse to cooperate with the United States because they see the United States as a bully, or the United States as a group that's going and imposing their will on countries when they don't really have the right to do so. So just because the United States has a strong economy, that doesn't give them the ability to impose measures on other economies. And it also does, so they shouldn't act unilaterally, that's one problem. But also, they've never explained why this is a universal solution to things. Yes, there might be one extreme case where a government has privatized the oil industry that has total control of it and they're really horrible to their people, and maybe then we should impose a sanction. But they've never explained why the United States policy should be that any governmentally controlled oil industry should have sanctions imposed upon them. We think that clearly is a problem that they miss as well. The second thing Alex talks about goes pretty much unaddressed throughout the round, and that's the efficacy of implementing sanctions. How we have no real groundwork for how it works. They never explained to us how we would do this, and they never explained to us why sanctions are effective in any way. The only thing that they say, I guess maybe in response to this, is that, well, the U.S. law says, I guess it wasn't even responsive to the point. They just had this idea that U.S. law says that we should stand up for corporations and treat them like an individual. But the United States, you can't prosecute people because they chose not to work with your company. That's not how U.S. law works. U.S. law says you have to protect the assets of the company, but it's not as if the privatized companies went into these areas and built them up and built up this whole industry, and then the government shoved them out and broke a contract. No, these are companies that never got involved in these regions, so they're never involved in those regions, so there's not even any losses for those companies. They simply just didn't get an ability to work in that region, which isn't something the United States can actually control. And two, how bad does it look that the United States says that we're the big defender of corporations? That's what people hate around the world, is that the United States is only in these regions for money, is only in these regions to defend corporations and not individuals, which is going to be a huge problem for the United States perspective around the globe and working for other issues. Which is what Alex talks about here with the backlash idea. That it's the problem, first of all, with the United States looking back to other countries, which I've spoken about. But and the response that we get to this is that in the long term, there's going to be freedom for this country, and so this country is going to be better off anyway. How, Madam Speaker? They've never explained how it's going to help the economy, how sanctions is going to result in any sort of market economy. In fact, many of these government industries are the only thing that are propping up economies. If you look at Russia's gas promise, the main nationalized oil industry there, that because so much money is in that industry, if the United States government were to remove it from their control or to impose sanctions, the economy of Russia would basically collapse because there's so many people dependent upon that money. So basically they're saying that yes, they've never explained how they're going to be helped in the long run when many of the people's money in the government, whether or not it's going into the pockets of individuals or not, or whether or not it's just money used to fuel the government, comes from these sort of industries. They're basically saying that they're going to put these countries in a state of poverty, and yet somehow that's going to make them better. They've never explained how that's going to result in anything good resulting from it. So they've never really shown how these governments are going to do any better, how the people are going to do that any better. So moving case side, they talk about this idea that markets are free and have all these good free results and it makes money for people. And Alex talks about how imposing sanctions doesn't necessarily make this market better, that it's not going to cause any sort of market better. And here's when I rise and I ask them again, please explain how sanctions is going to do anything. And the only thing that we get is that imposing sanctions will, I guess, make people see that the United States is great and the US knows what they're talking about, and so they're going to change their policies. No, that isn't how people respond to sanctions, Madam Speaker. People aren't going to just respond and change the way that their governments work because the United States says, hey, we think that you shouldn't have it working that way. That's not how international relations works. That's not how people respond. They respond with backlash, which makes it more difficult for us to cooperate with these countries, which makes it difficult for us to get other ideas that we're talking about, such as democracy being promoted in these countries. And it fosters the ideas of the people who believe in terrorism. It is allowed to foster those negative ideas in this region, so they backlash against the United States. They've never shown why people would just heed to the U.S. will. There's no reason why to believe that. Sure.
I did say that these policies that we implement will lead to economic prosperity and stability, but I'm wondering, how can you say that you could have no economic prosperity and a good democracy? I mean, look at Nigeria.
Okay, first of all, there's different levels of economic prosperity. So yes, maybe it would be preferable if this government were capable of having privatized industries and people buying shares, but that's not what these countries are capable of. And so there's no reason to believe that imposing sanctions is going to lead to any sort of free market in these regions. In fact, they talk about, well, there's a problem, maybe some people have, it's just lining the pockets of the rich people or the corrupt people, but very often the reason why these rich people and corrupt people aren't, slaughtering people in the country or aren't committing violence against the people is because many times the governments are given it in a sort of deal to have control of the oil industry in order to appease the people in the government as a whole. So very often these things are used as mechanisms to stabilize the country, and just because it's not entirely free doesn't mean that the country is not more stable and better off from it. And yet, even they've never proven how it's going to lead to any sort of free market economy by imposing sanctions or at all. So the next thing they're talking about is that the United States should endorse corporations. They never responded to Alex saying that the United States shouldn't just be endorsing corporations, that they have no obligation to do so, that it has backlash. The next thing that comes up is about how it's in the U.S. interest. We ask, why is it in our interest? Why ought we do it? Why are we morally able to do this? And why sanctions is the correct way to do it? We get no response to any of these things. They have to answer these three questions in order for them to be able to win this round at all. And then the last thing we talk about is about the idea about how people are not benefiting from the system. They talk about how they're not going to have the ability to buy shares in any sort of corporation. The way they're benefiting is by having the government having control of it. Yes, there might be some very corrupt governments, but we think that universally imposing this standard is also punishing the people who have uncorrupt governments who are giving some money to their people. It's just their way to control their funds and have money going to their government. So they've never really proven anything with this case. They simply asserted that one type of